Okay, so as Matt said, plan for today, we're going to talk to you about postgraduate research students in the Data Futures specification. The plan is I'm going to take you through the key fields within the model that apply to PGR students and some of the differences in the way that PGR students are recorded compared to other students, and then have a look at writing up and how that's returned to us. And then I'm going to pass over to Rachel, who's going to take you through how collaborative provision is recorded for PGR students. So we'll start off then with a couple of the headlines for the ways in which PGRs are returned differently. So first off, we don't require session years to be returned for postgraduate research students. So if you recall from previous knowledge shares, the session years record the planned dates for a course year, and students are associated to those, so we can see their activity compared to the planned dates. Feedback from providers, we ran a consultation earlier this year. Feedback from providers was that that doesn't apply to the majority of PGR programs, so they don't have the concept of a planned start date. Students might have a higher degree of flexibility of when they study. So session years will not be returned for PGR students. Instead, what we'll see is year-long student course sessions returned from whatever point in the year the student starts. They'll have year-long student course sessions until they finish. The second point, something else that's not required for PGR students, is modules. The difference with session years is that we will allow modules to be optionally returned for PGR students. Again, this came from the consultation on PGRs that we ran, where providers said that in a lot of cases, modules just don't apply to their PGR programs. Students don't work on a modular basis, but that there are often taught elements contained within PGR programs and specific modules that they would like to return. So the general feedback was that they don't want to have to return modules where that doesn't apply, but they do want to return them where it does. So module data is optional for PGR students to return. And finally, before we go into some of the more detailed sections, we still record in the model when a student moves to writing up status and a date for when they move to writing up. This is now recorded in the session status entity, and I'll go into a bit more detail about how that works a little later on. So if we have a look at the model then and where some of the key fields for PGRs are returned, as I've already said, we don't have a session year return for PGR students. So that entity that links into the student course session that says the planned start and end dates for a year, that's not required. The same is true of the modular data. So we have these student course sessions recording the student's activity, and they don't need to be linked to the modules or session year information. Some of the key entities that we'll look at today, at the engagement level, there are fields related to research councils where applicable if the student is a research council funded student. We've got the collaborative provision entity, which is associated with an engagement that Rachel will go into a bit more detail on, but records where the student is part of a collaborative provision arrangement and some extra information as well. And then at the student course session level, we have some specific fields about the student's activity, such as when did they submit their PhD. We have supervisor allocation, which records who's supervising the student and the applicable units of assessment. And then we have that session status entity that I've mentioned earlier, which records when they move to writing up. So quite a lot of the specific fields that we have for PGRs are against this student course session. It's recording some of the specific activity and supervision that relates to PGR students. So what I'll do then is run through those fields, starting with the engagement. As I said, at the engagement level, we're recording fields related to research councils. So we have the research council student field, which records where an engagement has been funded at any point by a research council. So what this means is that once an engagement has been returned as being funded by a research council, we would expect it to continue to be returned as funded until it ends, even if the student's funding runs out, because it's recording whether there was funding at any point rather than in a specific reference period or student course session, which is why it sits at that higher level of the engagement. Alongside that, if they are a Research Council student, we would also expect to see their Research Council student identifier. So that data can then be linked by the Research Councils using that identifier. And those are the two fields that we have at that engagement level. As I mentioned on the model, the collaborative provision entity also sits alongside the engagement entity. And this collaborative provision entity has two purposes. Firstly, we're recording whether the engagement is part of a collaborative provision arrangement with a non-UK provider. And that one isn't specific to PGR students. So that's any engagement that's part of that collaborative arrangement between the reporting provider and a provider outside the UK, and whether they are mainly in or outside the UK. The second purpose of the entity is where the engagement is part of a postgraduate research sequential collaborative provision arrangement. So the student starts off at provider A and then transfers to provider B. Provider B needs to tell us some information about the student at provider A so we can link those two engagements together. In order to do that, we've got 4 fields on that entity. So the first one, collaborative provision type, is that one that tells us they're part of an arrangement with an overseas provider, and are they mainly in the UK or mainly outside the UK? And then we have these 3 fields that do that linking up between the two providers. So if the student moves from provider A to provider B needs to tell us the UK PRN of provider A and the SID, the student identifier, the SID, and the NumHus that were returned by provider A, so we can link them together. But Rachel's going to go into a bit more detail of that with some examples as well. So next I will go through the different data items and entities that sit at the StudentCourse Session level, starting with Supervisor allocation entity. For those of you familiar with our current return, this is equivalent of the ref data entity. So what we're recording here is which organisations are supervising postgraduate research students and what are the applicable units of assessment associated with them. So again, we've got 4 fields to do that. The first is an ID field, so it's just a unique identifier defined by the reporting provider for that entity. We then have the HESA ID field, which records the identifier for the organisation that's providing that supervision. So in a lot of cases, we'd expect that to be a UK PRN, but we also have a couple of kind of generic valid entries for cases where that doesn't apply. For example, if it is one of those providers outside the UK or another UK organisation that wouldn't have a UK PRN. We then also want to know what the applicable unit of assessment is for that supervisor, and that is against the REF 2021 unit of assessment coding frame. This field wouldn't be required to be returned if the organisation recording HESA ID is one where REF isn't applicable. So for example, if it was a partner in industry rather than a UK provider that's eligible for REF, then the HESA ID would say it's a UK industry or commerce body, for example, and we wouldn't expect to see a unit of assessment because it's not applicable to that organisation. And we would then see a proportion as well to say for how much of the activity for the full student course session is being supervised by this combination of HESA ID and unit of assessment. And that entity would be repeated for however many combinations of organisation and unit of assessment there are for that student course session. We'd expect to see then that all of the proportions would add up to 100 as it's recording all the supervision for a given student course session across different organisations and units of assessment. So that's supervisor allocation, and that's a sub-entity of the student course session, but there are also a few fields that sit on the student course session itself that I will run through. The first one I mentioned earlier, we've got the PhD submission date. So this field indicates the date of the first submission of the thesis for PhD students. That means that once it's returned, we wouldn't expect it to change as it's the first submission. So if they have to do subsequent submissions, that doesn't reset the date. It's still the first submission. that would be returned there. We also have a new field in Data Futures that doesn't exist in our current student return of the intended thesis title. This one can change between student course sessions if the student intentions change, because it is their intended thesis title at a point in time rather than their first intention. It's currently optional. We added this in, I believe, in discussions with research councils and UKRI about some of the data they may be able to collect from us directly. It's not currently all being directly collected from us, so it's currently an optional field in here. And that is returned, as I said, on the student course session level and may change over time. The final two fields are as a result of module data not being required for PGR students. For all other students at providers in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, we have some information held at a module level about the language in which those modules are delivered, specifically where they're delivered in a Celtic language. It was generally agreed that modules data was not required for PGR students. However, this specific data is still required for PGR students in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So essentially it was a bit of overkill if we made them submit modules for all of their PGR students, just if this was the only data that was required. So we've made the modules optional, as I said, and then added these two fields to the student course session to replicate that same information, but for PGR students. So what we're interested in here is what is the relevant language that's recorded in the language ID field, and then what proportion of the student course session was delivered in that language. So it does mirror that requirement at the module level. What we have at the module level is the language ID for a given module and then the proportion of that module delivered in that language, whereas this is at the student course session level, so that we still have that information for PGR students. I mentioned there the intended thesis title, and we also have the thesis title field, which is collected against the leaver entity and the qualification awarded. So we have the intended thesis title on the student course session, which may evolve over time as the student's intentions change. And then at the point that they finish, we have a field to record the actual thesis title. Again, as I've explained for intended thesis title, this is currently optional. So the final part that I was going to take you through was, as I've mentioned, this session status entity and how we record students writing up. So the final thing then, as I said, that I'll go through is writing up, and we're going to look at an example of a student, of a PGR student, and some of the other fields that would be returned to them in relation to them moving to writing up. So in this example, we have Jean completing her postgraduate research course. And as I've said, there is no session year for PGR students. So what you would have is one student course session returned for each year that the student studies, starting from the point that they start. So Jean starts in September 2019. And so year-long student course sessions are returned until the final student course session, where the end date reflects when Jean actually finishes her study. If another student started in April or August, then that is the point from which this year-long student course sessions would start. In student course session 3, Jean moves to writing up mode in February 2022. So let's look at how that would be returned. The session status entity is what records that the student has moved to a writing up mode. So the status change 2 would be 04, which means writing up. And the status valid from date would say February 2022. So we know that Jean is now writing up, and we know the date from which that status applied. Also here, you've got some of the other fields that I've spoken about. So at the engagement level, you would have the relevant research council and research council identifier. Jean would have her supervisor allocation returned. In this case, it's 100% is attributed to this organisation and unit of assessment, but that entity could be repeated multiple times if that wasn't the case. And then you also might have, depending on where the provider is, so for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, you would have these language fields returned as well. So that would be returned in Student Course Session 3. But Jean continues writing up into a 4th Student Course Session. And so this Student Course Session was open for a year. They can't be longer than a year, so it's closed down at that point. But Jean is still writing up, so she needs a new Student Course Session to record that. Because she's still writing up, we would still expect to see a session status entity return to say that. So we've still got a status change 2 of 04 to say she's writing up. We also have the same date. So even though that date is now before the start of this student course session, we still expect to see the same date because that's the date from which Jean was writing up. So the date remains the same, as does the fact that we'd expect to see supervisor allocation information returned, and the same at the engagement level. What might be different is the point at which Jean submits her PhD. So you'd expect to see a PhD submission date at the point that she does that. I've just realised that that date is after her end date, so please ignore that date. You wouldn't expect her to submit her PhD after she'd finished. But you would expect to see a PhD submission date at the point that Jean first submits her PhD. And when she completes her engagement, we'd see a leaver entity returned with whatever the relevant reason for ending is, and an end date as well. And for PGR students, the definition of an end date is slightly different to other students. It is in relation to when the student's award is confirmed. So the point that Jean's award is confirmed should be given an end date and a leaver entity to show that, with any applicable qualification awarded. So just to summarise some of that then, for writing up, the status change date must reflect the date on which the student moved to writing up status. That's the date from which that writing up status applies. And therefore, if a student is writing up across a lot of different student course sessions, that date may be in a previous student course session. But that's what we want the provider to return, to keep that date consistent if that's when the student moved to writing up status. Just a note on FTE for writing up students. We've got the same guidance in Data Futures as we have in our current student return. So if a student is writing up for a full year, they would have an FTE of 10 recorded for that year student course session. And if they were writing up for part of the year and studying for the other part, then that would be proportioned out based on that baseline of 10 being one full year of writing up. And finally, as I've said, the engagement ends at the point that the Senate or awarding authority approves the award. So slightly different end date guidance for PGRs versus taught students. And that is everything that I was going to take you through today.
So collaborative provision. So first thing to say then is that this is very, very similar to what we currently refer to as collaborative provision in the student record. So there are two types. There is the concurrent and there is sequential. The concepts are exactly the same. It's just simply the way that you will be returning them in the Data Futures record that is different. So I will step through both. So starting with concurrent collaborative provision. So this is the case where you've got more than one provider looking after that student and I suppose collaborating on their studying. But only one provider is allowed to return to HESA at a time. So one of their providers is returning data to us, but therefore they need to kind of reflect something that another provider is doing. So in the example I've picked in both these cases actually, I've picked a lead provider and the University of Popperton. So the lead provider in this example is going to be the one returning the data to HESA. So what do we have? We have students studying on a course. So this will be probably a PGR type course. And they are going to submit the course role data. So that is sitting off the course entity. And what that is then going to reflect is who is delivering the actual the content for the student. So for this example I've picked easy numbers here, I'll be honest. So we've got a 50-50 split. The lead provider, which is the submitting provider, is doing half of that, so they return themselves, and the University of Popperton is delivering the other half, so they get returned in a second course role. So that's telling us up front, this is what we think is going to happen for this course. So then moving on to the students themselves. So you will be returning their engagement. And what will happen for these examples, don't worry about the detail of these boxes. There's a lot of text, you don't need to look at them. It's just the fact the box is there that is crucial for this. So we've got 3 years for the student. I've kept it easy to fit it on the screen. So you've got the first student course session returned. You then return the study location. That is something sitting off student course session. And that can tell us exactly where that student is studying. So you can reflect when they might be on, I've called it our campus, the campus of the lead provider, the one submitting the data, and potentially the campus of the University of Popperton, if that's what they're doing. Then you can return the supervisor allocation entity, again, sitting off student course session. And so, as Ruth has explained, you can return the units of assessment depending on what's relevant. Again, I've picked two easy examples here, one for each of the providers, but there could be as many as necessary. So that's how you return it, really. You're kind of returning the location and any supervisor allocation, reflecting the other provider that's also taking part in delivering this, well, in the example, I'm giving the PGR course to the students. So in the future years, you basically do the same thing. You just keep returning it when it's relevant, the study location or supervisor allocation, reflecting any change. So in this year, change the figures, it's a different split. And you just return whatever is happening during that student course session. So that's the first type. The second type then is sequential collaborative provision. So this is again where you've got more than one provider. But what tends to be the example I pick for these ones is where you've got kind of 1 year perhaps doing some teaching, more teaching type thing. And then they go off and do their PhD for, say, 3 years. So they're kind of 1+3 approach. And they are fully kind of moving off to that provider. And so what we agreed, actually, I looked at the notes this morning, it was 2015 we agreed this for the student record. We agreed there could be a kind of handshake to pass off that student to the second provider. I mean, in the 1+3 returns, if you kept returning that student for their second, third and fourth years, you don't actually have that student on your campus. And so in these cases, it might make sense to kind of pass off the student, but we have to be very clear that that is what you're doing. So that's what some of these fields are kind of reflecting, as they do now in the student record. So again, I've picked the same providers. So I've got the lead provider and the University of Popperton. So we're going to have the first year at the University of Popperton, and then the next two, only two because I was fitting it on the slides really, at the lead provider. So that's the main provider. I probably should have called it that. So in terms of the data, in terms of the course level data, so in the first year, you would return the course. The University of Popperton, sorry, would return the course. And you would split the course role here to reflect the fact that most of this is going to be at the lead provider, but actually University of Popperton is doing parts of this. So I've kind of done a third split to reflect the 1 plus years 2 and 3. Then when you get to years 2 and 3, the lead provider is going to be returning this. And again, they will be returning a course, and similarly, the course role as well. So that's the course level detail. Stepping down into the student level detail. So starting off with the University of Popperton, that's where they start off. We have their engagement. So they're going to have just one student course session because they're there for 12 months. And they will have a study location to say that they are studying at the University of Popperton for this student course session. And so the proportion is 100%. They will return supervisor allocation. So again, I picked an easy example. I've just done the same unit assessment as 100%, but you could return as many as applicable. So at the end of that student course session, when that student leaves, the intended destination field will be returned to say it's going off to the lead provider. So that's the person they're going off to in the second year. Then the end date on the leaver record will be the date they transferred. That's the date that they stop studying at the University of Poppleton. And so in the reason end field, you would return code 12, which is they're transferring out as part of this specific kind of collaborative supervision. So looking at other things to note, the expected end date. On the engagement, when you return that expected end date, you'd return it to reflect the whole of the PhD or whatever they're studying, which in this example, I've picked as 3 years long. You wouldn't say that it's only a year long to reflect the Poppleton's, what Poppleton is contributing to this. It would be the whole thing. That is what the student has signed up to study, is that whole program. So that is their expected end date. However, as I said, the end date on the leaver reflects the date the student transfers. That's when the University of Poppleton stops returning. So that is the end date for them. So that's after 1 year for this. So that's the University of Poppleton. Now moving on into the second year. So the lead provider is returning the student in this case. So they are returning an engagement with whatever details they need. And as Ruth stepped through at the beginning, they are then returning the collaborative provision entity. So what these three fields do, so NUMHURST, SID and UKPRN, you are returning what happened at the partner for the partner that you're kind of taking the student off from. So you're returning these identifiers so that we can then go back to that provider with that SID, with that NUMHURST, and link it and say, yes, this is part of the same course. So that's why you're doing it. You return it when they are passed off to you, if you like, and you need to make sure all three of those are filled in. So again, looking at some of the specifics. So the start date is going to be the date that the student actually transferred to this provider. So that then matches up with the leaver date from the provider that, so in this case, University of Poppleton, that stopped returning them. So we can be sure that, you know, that's the same date, and so that is why that is what's happened. Again, the expected end date is for the whole of the PhD, so it's probably, or hopefully, going to be the same date as it was at the University of Poppleton. So after the 3 years of that student study, that is when they're expected to end. So I guess at this point, that would be kind of 2 years in the future. And as I said, it's the collaborative provision, those three fields that indicates that the student has transferred from somewhere else. Just a quick note on the entry profile, because we always get this as a question. You have to return the entry profile again at the second provider, so this is the lead provider. But we accept the fact that you are returning the same data as the first provider. So there is no requirement to actually update that data. It can be as the position was at the beginning of that student starting their 3-year course. So then moving on to the student level data for the lead provider. So this is the second year of the kind of student, but first year at the lead provider. So you're returning a student course session, which will be 1 for the lead provider, although it's the student's kind of second year. Returning the location of what's relevant and returning the supervisor allocation that is relevant. And you do the same for the second year. At the end of the second year then, so we're going to assume that the student has finished after 3 years and done what they intended to do. You then return the leaver record and hopefully a qualification awarded as well. So the engagement end date at that point is obviously then going to be at the point they finish. So hopefully the end of their whole 3-year course in this example. And the reason for end will then be kind of left unawarded for credit or qualification. So just wrapping up all the dates that we've discussed, the end date is for the end of the whole PhD. So that does kind of tie up, hopefully, with what is expected, their expected end date, sorry. So just briefly stepping over, we've gone through all the bits of things that get returned. So just to remind you, so in the concurrent study, the one provider who is returning that student then reflects what is happening at the other provider. So in terms of the supervisor allocation or study location or something, they kind of return that data for them. In the sequential example, one provider starts to return it and returns any of the kind of relevant things, study location, supervisor allocation, and then they return a leaver record and say they're transferring the student. And then the second provider again returns the student with the relevant kind of supervisor allocation, study location details. Crucially, with this collaborative provision to say that I have taken the student from a different provider. And then at the point that student finishes, hopefully, then they would return a leaver entity and hopefully a qualification awarded as well at that point. So I think that is the end. Yes, the main thing to take from this is it is the same concepts as in the student record. It's just slightly in a different place to reflect the data futures model, but the principles of what you're doing and why they're being returned in that way is all the same.
Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.